Hi everyone, this is Alex for FNC Poker, and today I'm going to run you through some spots where I bet you don't find enough aggression. So this video is dedicated to all of you who struggle with the red line or who have a low win-once off flop and are not really sure what to do with it. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks and show you a few spots that you can pay attention to and make sure to apply more aggression because they might not necessarily be super intuitive. Before we get into the hands, I would like to remind you that the enrollment for our CFP is still open. We're running a small CFP where we're trying to have as much close contact to the student as possible, which I think is quite rare on the market for people who play micro stakes, 25NL, and so on. So if you're interested in that, make sure to reach out through our Discord that I'll leave in the description. So the first spot that we're going through is going to be check raising out of position, especially in 3-bet pots, but I think this is quite a common leak to most of our students. In lower stakes, they don't really find enough check raises out of position, no matter if it's a single raise pot or a 3-bet pot. So what's happening here? We go for a 3-bet against cutoff. This hand, it would be a very rare 3-bet for me. Maybe I had some read on my opponent that he's folding a lot to 3-bets, or maybe I thought I have some bigger post-flop edge, I don't really remember. But usually I would not really 3-bet this hand, or I would 3-bet at a very low frequency. And we see on the flop we go for a check, which might be surprising for some of you. This is a spot where I would go 3/4 or check, and when we have king jack, especially with the jack of spades, because it doesn't play as good as a check call or a check raise, this would be very close to a pure bet. However, in this hand I probably rolled very high and I decided it's not going to be a pure bet, so I decided to check. And we face a small stab, which should be quite common on this board. Our opponent should go for a small stab and quite mergy to try and get value / protection from overcards with a lot of middling pairs and 10x and maybe even some ace-queen. I'm not sure if that happens in cutoff, but from the button even ace-queen can be a thin value bet here. And we decide to go for a check raise. Now, looking at this hand, for some of you this might seem quite intuitive, for others it might seem like what the hell is this, but the idea is we need to think this is not a board where we can range bet, right? So that means we're gonna have a decent amount of checks. So when we have a decent amount of checks, it means we're going to check some overpairs in order to check raise. And then it also means we should have some bluffs to go along with that. And for a lot of people those would be flush draws or some semi-bluffs, but in reality we also need some trashier hands, because if we do this with flush draws all the time, we can just get shoved on and be in a really difficult spot or not get to realize our equity. And also when a flush hits on the turn, it's basically we never have bluffs because now we only have overpairs or flush draws. And then also our EV would kind of go lower if we never used these hands as check raises and we just check folded them. And also, exploitatively speaking, I think people do overfold to check raises exactly because of this dynamic where, well, most villains don't really find the complete bluffs, so then their check raising range is going to be way too equity driven. So I think it is quite important to find this, and maybe it's not super intuitive in game, but it is a good tip to think, okay, what is my range here? How am I supposed to structure my range? And then to make sure that I have in every line a bit of everything, a bit of trash, a bit of semi-bluffs, a bit of value, of course. And when I say trash, of course, we're not gonna start check raising here 6-7 of clubs because it's trash. But here we have two overcards, we have a backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, and it doesn't really play well as a check call. So if we end up checking this hand, it should be pretty much a pure check raise. They call and the turn is a 9, bringing a double flush draw. So in this line here, if we decide to go for a bet, it should be all in or fold. And we are going to go all in with some flush draws that we check raise, but as I said, we also need to have some trash in there. And our bluffs are going to come from hands like ace queen, ace king, that don't block the ace of spades, because those hands are definitely going to get some better hands to fold, you know, the under pairs that call on the flop, but they're also going to get some worse hands to call. So if we have ace queen with the ace of spades, let's say, without the ace of spades, they can just call us with ace 5 with spades or something like that. So those are quite good bluffs to get all in. And of course, if we get called by something like jacks, we also have outs to a better pair. And then, yeah, some of our flush draws, and then we're going to shove with our value. But this hand is actually quite trashy now, it blocks some folds, so it should be a give up at this point. It goes check check, the river is an 8, and again it might look like we block a straight or something, but it's quite unlikely. I mean, he could have, yes, king, queen, jack of spades particularly, but then if you think of our range on a board like this, we'd probably shove a lot of our value on the turn, and then when we get to the river, we're probably gonna have a few slow plays, but not that many, and it's also not a super credible line. So even though this might seem neaty, I decide to give up here, which is actually the correct decision. He checks back and we lose against ace 9, which, yes, it is a hand that might fall to a shove if we shove the river, but we need to remember that when we shove the river here, we don't have that much value, it's not a super credible line, and we should be quite selective with our bluffs, at least make sure we don't block a lot of folds, and with this one we kind of do. So even though we lost the hand, I think this is a very well played hand, and I think it's also a spot where most of you that watch don't really find enough aggression on the flop, I mean. So yeah, keep that one in mind. Let's move on to the next one. The second spot I want to talk about, I'm going to illustrate with this hand, which we open small blind, we get called by the big blind, and it's actually not about bluffing this time. Yes, when we talk about aggression, a lot of people think, not finding enough bluffs. Definitely that's what not being aggressive enough means, but sometimes it also means not finding the thin value bets, and I think if we think in terms of red line, then it's even more of an issue, you know, not finding these thin value bets and ending up check folding on the river, or it goes check check and then we miss value, but then what happens is our blue line goes up, right? Our red line doesn't move, but then we lose without showdown, so it's going to become a really big gap between the blue line and the red line. So what I'm trying to say with this is, for example, here, king 8-6 is a board where I would just simplify to a range bet, especially on a rainbow board, blind versus blind. I would use a quarter. Pot size bets, they end up calling, and the turn is a 10. Now here, I would probably go for pot or even overbet or check. Usually when a straight completes, we don't really want to use overbets anymore, but here big blind isn't really calling 9-7 offsuit. 9-7 suited is going to be raised on the flop quite often, so this is not a super relevant straight. The board is still quite good for us, so I think we can still end up overbetting, but the pot size strategy is fine too. The idea is it's going to be a very polar strategy, so we're going to use our best bluffs that have some kind of equity or good blockers at least, and then our best value hand. So queen 8 here, way too strong to turn into a bluff, way too weak to value bet, just gonna go for a pure check. In position checks back, and the river is a 5. So now, maybe a lot of you would think, I just have a medium strong hand, let's check and try to get to showdown. But what we need to do is try to go back to the flop and to the turn and think about, okay, how does my range look like here, and how does in position's range look like here? And then when we think of that, we realize, okay, we open very wide pre-flop, we range bet on the flop, and then on the turn we kind of get rid of our best bluffs, of course, and our best value hands. So by the river we're going to get with quite a wide range, because in position also checks back. When we bet a quarter on the flop, in position is also supposed to call very wide, including stuff like ace highs, all his pairs, and so on and so forth. So what's happening here is that we have a situation where we have to decide, do we want to value bet thin or do we want to bluff catch? And although there are some arguments in the favor of bluff catching, meaning because of the ranges are going to be super wide, it is quite likely this spot is going to be over bluffed. But Queen 8 is still a very strong value hand in this configuration, especially if we use a small size, which we should. We should actually have a small size here that encompasses our, third pair and stuff like that, and then a big size for our good second pairs and top pairs. And very often, these hands that are kind of middling are going to be higher EV by value betting ourselves than by bluff catching. And the reason for this is that when we bet small, we're going to get value from some hands that would never reopen the action, maybe some 5x, maybe some lower 8x, maybe some 6x, maybe even some ace highs. And then when we check, those hands are not going to reopen the action, but if he does have a value hand such as a 10, a king, stuff like that, they are just going to bet bigger, and then we call and end up losing more money. Now, if we think this spot is insanely overbluffed, then okay, it might be better to put it in a check line, especially if this is a bit lower. Let's say if we had like a 9-8, then yes, but the idea is a lot of people don't really think of this hand as being a value bet at all, which is quite a big mistake. Actually, just going to show you really quick how this range should look like. We should have a big size, as I said, a small size, but then look how thin we are supposed to value bet. So basically any 8x is going for a value bet here, and even some 7s we can go for a value bet. These ones are probably the kind of mixed hands where we get some better to fold, we get some worse to call. But the idea is very, very thin, going for value, and finding this is actually what is going to improve your red line quite a lot. Again, not going to go too deep into solver analysis today, but if that's something you're interested in, maybe let us know in the comment and we're going to do some deeper analysis of these hands or other hands in the future videos. Going back to the hand, what happened here is we bet small and our opponent calls with a 6, which illustrates exactly what I was trying to highlight here, is that this hand would probably never reopen the action and we would lose value against it. But then if we were to have a 10 here, we would check, they would probably bet half pot or bet 3/4, we'd have to call that. So overall we'd end up losing way more money, and this is why in a lot of spots you see these thin value bets being higher EV than putting the same hand into a bluff catching line. Okay, the next spot is going to go hand in hand with what I talked about previously, that you're not finding enough thin value bets. So now that you know in a lot of these spots we should find thin value bets, that means we should also bluff for small sizes sometimes. And I think it's quite normal in a way that people are afraid of bluffing or not really finding enough bluffs if we think whenever we bluff we need to go huge or we need to really scare our opponent. That's not really the case, and I'm going to show you in this hand what I mean by that. We open Queen 8 suited on the small blind, big blind calls, and Jack 5. Again, with a flush draw in the solver it might not be a pure range, but I think simplifying is just fine. And if you don't believe me, maybe play yourself with GTO Wizard AI that you can get through our link in the description and see if you think people are defending enough on these textures, not only by calling, which they don't, but also by check raising, which they miss even less. So all of these lead us to being able to range bet a lot of boards that in theory shouldn't really be range bet. So I go for a range bet, they call, turn is a 3, and at this point again we need to think about how ranges look like. When we range bet on a paired board, especially if our opponent don't really find enough raises, then what's happening is that on the turn we're getting with a very wide range and we can still value bet really, really thin. I mean, even ace high I think can still be value bet here. We can definitely keep betting with a lot of our pairs, but that's if we keep betting small. And what that means is that obviously we need to find some bluffs in the small sizing as well. And on this texture, it's not that easy to find high equity bluffs. And when we bet small, we have to bet quite frequently, so we definitely don't have enough stuff like flush draws, gut shots, and so on to bet here, so we need to find other bluffs. And what properties should those bluffs have? Well, one of them should be to unblock missed backdoor flush draws, so not having hearts, which we do. Another one would be if we get called by, lower pairs such as 5s, 5x, 3x, 6s, and so on, to have relatively good outs to hit a pair, which again we do with this hand. We don't really block a lot of bluffs, and again we don't really have showdown value either, because if we had something like an ace here, that would be a check or even a thin value bet. If we had a king, that's enough showdown value to check, but with queen high it gets a bit lower, so I think this is probably a hand that we should barrel very, very frequently, if not pure. So we decide to go for it. As I said, we're still going to use a small size because we want to value bet very wide here. They call. I think this size might actually be a bit too small. I would use something like 40% or half pot. And the river is a 10. So again, we need to think about what properties our hand has. We don't block missed backdoor flush draws or missed flush draws. We do block some jack-X that decided not to raise on the flop. We don't really block very obvious bluffs. I mean, we do block some queen 5, 8-5 that he might fold sometimes, but not queen 3, not a3, which, I mean, a3 they shouldn't have, but queen 3, yeah. Anyway, and we still have no showdown value, and again, most importantly, the first thing we should think about is what our value range is here, and we can definitely still keep betting quite thin, 7s, even 6s, 8s. If we bet for a small size, we should keep betting, which allows us to bet for quite a high frequency. We already filtered some of our range on the turn, so I think this is quite a good hand to go for another small barrel. And they fold. And the reason why this hand makes it into this video is that I think this line is not really used often enough. It's quite a cheap bluff. It does fit with our value range, and also I would assume it's very overfolded because here villain should call a lot of ace highs. I wouldn't be surprised if they should even call some king highs. So yeah, it's a good exploit, it's a good play in theory, and it prints, so make sure you find some of these in your next sessions. Just to illustrate this very quickly, you remember I said 6s, we can actually bet 6s for a big size and 5s and lower for a small size. Even 3x can be a value bet. And then in terms of what in position is supposed to call, a lot of king highs are calling, a lot of ace highs are calling. So yeah, make sure to remember this spot is going to be overfolded, and make sure to find these small bets. Let's move on then. Next hand, some of you might find it quite similar with the initial hand we looked at. We decided to squeeze on the cutoff with king 8 suited, which is not a very frequent squeeze, but I would use it sometimes. Small blind folds, the regular on the button calls, and the board is ace 10-4 with a flush draw. Now, from the big blind, it really depends how you construct your ranges. Usually you should lower our frequency a little bit because we end up calling a decent amount of ace highs instead of 3-betting them. I usually structure it a bit more linear. I 3-bet a lot more ace-x than most ranges suggest, especially in a lineup like this. So I think range betting here is still fine, especially if we assume people are not finding raises on this flop or are not defending enough, but it is a simplification and it should be taken with a grain of salt because this is probably not exactly the GTO play. They call and turn is a deuce of spades. Now, again, when we range bet the flop and they call, we need to be very careful on the turn, especially on a board like this. So we need to be selective with our bluffs and use, stuff with equity, stuff with decent blockers, but this one doesn't really have either of them. It does unblock backdoor flush draws from the flop, but it's not the same situation because now the backdoor flush draw hits. So we have a bunch of better hands to bluff with, and our frequency should also be quite low. So I decide to pure check this hand. It goes check check, and now the river is a queen. If in the previous hand I was saying if we bluff here is not a super credible line because we don't have that much value, so on and so forth, here the situation is much different because when the queen gets there on the river, it actually improves a decent amount of our hands that bet the flop and check the turn, such as queens. We'd probably check some ace queen from time to time. We're gonna have some queen 10. We're gonna have king jack, including some offsuit combos, especially in a squeeze spot. I would squeeze king jack quite often, and because our betting frequency on the turn is quite low, I'm going to slow down with some of those. So then, if we know that this card improves to very strong hands a lot of our turn checks, then it means we should probably have a shove size here. And if we have a shove size for value, we should also have some bluffs in that size. And when we put so much money into the pot, we need to be very selective with our bluffs. And I was thinking here, okay, this is probably one of the best bluff candidates because it doesn't block clubs, it doesn't block spades, it does block king jack, it has pretty much no showdown value, and again, except for some eights, it doesn't really block folds. So yeah, and it's probably one of the worst hands in my range as well, so I decided to go for it and use a big size. I would have a small size here either, but considering I thought this is one of our best bluffs, I decided to shove, and unfortunately we lose the hand, we get called by aces, but that doesn't mean our hand is not well played, and if you don't believe me, we can quickly run through GTO Wizard and see if that's the case. Okay, so first let's change this to a range bet, which as I said might be a bit of an overstretch. I'm not really sure my squeezing range would have all of these lower stuff, so this same is going to be a bit off. But just to illustrate the concepts I was talking about, you see quite a low betting frequency, and we're going to pick our high equity hands. If we look at no mate hand, no draw, apparently there's this 8-7 anomaly, but we're not really picking those, and our hand is going to be a pure check. And once it goes check check, of course there's a lot of things that we can explore about this sim, but let's just make it quick. And we see on this queen we start having some shoves because it does help some of our turn checks, as I said. And if we look at this hand, it's actually a pure bluff and it is going into the big size quite a lot. So this king x of diamonds and hearts are probably one of our best bluffs by the river, and this is why we start shoving with this. Apparently some jack x too. But yeah, blocking king jack, not blocking folds. You get the idea. The reason I wanted to talk about this hand is that it's very intuitive here to go small or to find, you know, some 3/4 bet or something like that. But in reality, our bluff sizes always need to be consistent with our value range, and there are hands that we want to shove here, so we also need to grow the balls to shove some of our trash hands and find the good properties. Of course, the results is not as desired, but I think this spot we will gain enough folds, so it is important to find a line like this from time to time. Alright, last but not the least spot we are going to talk about, which I guess it's repeated over and over again. It can show up in very different scenarios, but it's always the same underlying concept, which is identifying capped ranges and being brave enough to click the shove button against them. So in this hand we end up flatting the big blind with 9-7 suited, we flop an open-ender and it goes check check check. Button is most likely a recreational with 21 big blinds behind. So I think this is quite relevant in this hand because in this particular scenario I think it's quite unlikely cutoff will check a lot of very strong hands here, such as sets or even good top pairs or even over pairs. Yeah, because there's a recreational and he's so short, and especially if he wasn't aggressive or anything, I think cutoff is quite likely to bet his best hands on the flop. Turn is a king, and obviously this is not a great card for us. It completes, I mean, it brings value to a lot of the combos cutoff has checked on the flop. So, and in general it doesn't really improve our range from big blind when we flat all that often, so we need to be quite careful on this card. What we mean by being quite careful is that we should have a low betting frequency, and when we do bet it should probably be quite polar for a relatively big size, because we are wrapping really strong hands and good bluffs and we're not really betting any medium strength hands. So when we check a lot, it means we're also going to check a decent amount of our draws. And a lot of people here as in position don't really understand how tight we should be here and that our ranges should still be very protected. So they are going to value bet a bit thinner than they should. So he bets the recreational calls, and now we decide to go for a check raise. Of course, as I said, we are uncapped. In position is actually quite capped because we expect him to bet most of his value hands on the flop, and of course he's going to have ace king, king queen, stuff like that, but those one pair hands are often not really able to stand enough pressure. So we go for a check raise, we get called by the regular recreational folds, and river is an 8. So here my thoughts were, well, this is quite a bad card for us because it removes a lot of our 2-pair combos such as king 8, we only have the suited ones, 10-8, we also only have the suited ones, 8, which is in our range. So a lot of the hands we might have had as value on the turn are now discounted, so we need to be quite careful here. Also, all draws miss, and I think this is a spot where people end up being a bit stationy, so I decide to just check and give up this hand. We also block some folds like Jack 9, which they might have, 9-7, of course, if they don't bet the flop. So yeah, I decide to give up, and now in position bets 3/4, and I think this is a spot where a lot of people make the mistake of value betting too thin, because what's happening here is that my range by the river is going to be traps and give ups. I'm not going to have, I don't know, Jack 10 or Ace 10 that plays like this. And then I will actually have some traps here because I understand this is not a good card for me. I should refrain from bluffing some cards that have less value. So overall I should have a bit more checks. And because I think people end up value betting too thin here with hands like ace king, king queen too frequently, I decide to go for a check shove. And also because of my analysis on the flop, because I think he doesn't really have, I mean, I could have king 8, I guess, but I don't think he has king 10, I don't think he has 10-8, I don't think he has a full house here, I don't think he has kings. So I think his range is going to be very capped. And I think they also value bet too thin, so I can put a lot of pressure here. Now, in terms of my hand, I think this is probably quite a terrible check shove because, as I said, it blocks a lot of folds, it doesn't really block any value, and when we take these check shoving lines, we should actually be quite selective with our bluffs. So even though I knew this is a bad hand selection, I think in practice people are going to overfold this pot so much that I can just play it like this. Maybe with any two, I don't want to overstretch it, but like it's not a lot of hands that I have here. First of all, going check on the turn and then check raising huge and then checking the river with. So I think at least exploitatively this is printing money. I hope you don't know my nickname, so you can start calling against me in game. But yeah, we do get a fold, and I think this is a very good example of how keeping track of the ranges throughout the duration of the hand and understanding how each action influences what the range looks like and how we can exploit that, basically identifying capped ranges in more words. I think this is a very important skill that you should cultivate as a poker player, and if you don't know how to do it yourself, come into our CFP or join our training programs to figure it out. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, I would really love to hear it in the comments. And yeah, let us also know in there what you'd like to see for our next videos, because I'm not that inspired. And yeah, I'd like to know what our audience likes to watch. See you in the next videos.